Thank you very much to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present here this joint work with David Otter, which is on the evolution of new work in the 20th century. So this, how does this work? All right. This work is very much sort of set against the backdrop of overall changes in the employment structure that we are seeing in many developed economies, known as job polarization, illustrated in this figure as, ranking broad occupation groups by the sort of wage they pay or their skill level. So, here at the left, we have the lower paying occupations like personal services. In the middle, we have things like production work, admin and sales. And then at the top, the highest paying, high skilled work in professionals and managers. And what we're seeing is a sort of declining middle, known as job polarization of, declining employment shares in those office and admin and production work, but at the same time, an increase in the employment shares at the top as well as at the bottom. Now, these changes play out both, among different skill groups as well. So this is showing that same polarization pattern for non-college workers and college workers, where I'm here defining non-college workers as those with a high school degree or less, and college workers as those with some college or more. And what this is showing is that both of these groups have witnessed that declining middle, that hollowing out the job structure, but the reallocation pattern has been quite distinct. So there's been, for these higher skilled workers, there's been a reallocation towards the top predominantly, and for these lower skilled workers, there's been a reallocation towards the bottom. Now, what this figure does not inform on is sort of where is new work or where are new activities arising in these economies. So this sort of creates the impression that there's a sort of ever narrowing set of activities that labor is engaged in, right? There's a sort of decline here that's been mostly ascribed to automation. And then, that's what's left for labor. So this is not really speaking much to the evolution of new work. So that's what we're trying to do in this paper, is to think about, empirically, how can we link new work to these overall changes in job structure and labor demand that we're seeing in these countries. So just to give a bit of a background on this literature, so the way that obviously these changes in the job structure have been thought of as linking to technological progress, and in particular, a set of models that are task-based have been developed that think of technology as both displacing and complementing different sets of tasks. So then you basically have a task space where the assignment of machines and labor to those tasks is changing. And as automation progresses, more and more of those tasks are being assigned to machines, and there's also changing allocation, of tasks for workers of different skill groups. So that helps explain these non-monotonic changes in the job structure that we've been seeing, but it does not really inform on any new activities arising, because task-based is held fixed in these models. But we know from empirical evidence that was first provided by Jeff Lynn already in 2011 that there is new work that's actually arising. So he looked at US evidence from 1970 to 2000 and showed, look, there are these new jobs that are just arising in different places. And that's something that was missing from this task view. And then Duran and Pascual came up with a set of papers. I'm not sure this is an exhaustive list, but to really show that the sort of missing link in these task literature to understand what's happening to the job structure is really new work, right? So to say, if you think of automation as narrowing the set of tasks that people perform, there's a countervailing mechanism that is a reinstatement, that is reinstating labor in these new tasks, which they model to be skill-using tasks, right? So, this important addition to the view of how labor demand is changing throws up a bunch of new questions on, what is the nature of this new work? Like, what do we actually know about new work? And empirically, the answers are surprisingly little. So we know from what Lynn has documented, and also Duran and Pascual have used these data to provide some further evidence in the context of the task model specifically, but we don't yet know much about longer time periods, sort of broader categories of new work, and sort of how this is changing. So that's what we're trying to do in this paper, besides playing fast and loose with the term paper. Apologies to our discussant for that. But we're aiming to do these things, and I'll show you some preliminary results on some of them, and hopefully whet your appetite for what is to come. So the first thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be expanding the sort of time period we're covering. So Jeff Lynn, really in his pioneering work, looked at 1970 to 2000. We're going to be expanding that to cover the entire 20th century and some change in the 21st. We're also going to be looking sort of more broadly at the types of new work that's being created. So Jeff Lynn, in his paper, focused, in his examples and his discussion, very much on the sort of high-skill, high-tech frontier work emerging in skill-intensive cities. Also, these task frameworks sort of think typically about, lower-skilled tasks being automated and then new labor using high-skill tasks being added, right? But when we're looking at these sort of new titles that are emerging, we're sort of struck by the fact that they're not all that technology using, all of them, or all that skill intensive necessarily. So we're trying to sort of broaden the scope of thinking about what kinds of new work are really being added. And then most importantly, we want to explore, how has the locus broadly of this new work changed over time? So really, how has new work evolved? And when we're saying locus, we're thinking very broadly, like distribution across occupations compared to existing work, and then also the wage, education, and gender characteristics of workers in those new occupations, as well as sort of a spatial analysis. So that's sort of our hypothesis there, is that locus of new work has changed in important ways over history. So the idea being that new work now is more skill using, more skill intensive than it used to be, and that has important consequences for labor demand and the structure of work. Okay, and then these 2 points, which we aim to do, but we don't have much evidence on yet, but I just want to mention, we want to go beyond the sort of occupational new work approach that Lynn developed to also look at individual workers that are employed in these new jobs. We're going to be using that using complete count census, historical data, and hopefully also some more recent write-in data from the census as well. And then lastly, we want to also describe the task content of this new work using some textual information from, for example, the Dictionary of Occupational Titles. All right, so just to talk a little bit about measurement, so how are we going to be measuring new work? And I'm going to first describe, Jeff Lynn's approach, and then later I'll expand a little bit about this sort of more micro-level analysis that we aim to add in the future. So basically, the way that Jeff Lynn that he came up with is to say, look, there are these lists called Census Alphabetical Index of Occupations. So these are released with every census of population, and they basically are like a phone book of occupational titles. They're extremely detailed, so there's about 15 to 30,000 titles per volume. And what these serve for is basically census forms that have write-ins of people's occupational self-described job. These coders use this index of occupations to then classify those write-ins into census occupations. So they're a coding aid, and they're intended as such. And because they're intended as such, they're classified to an occupation, and they are going to be useful for documenting new work, because census, whenever new write-ins are emerging that the coders can't easily class into an existing occupation, they add new titles to accommodate that. All right, and we found these lists for a long time period, covering this whole period. Okay, so just to give a little bit of flavor, like what is this actually like? So this is the introduction from the 1990 list, which says, this list contains around 30,000 occupation titles. It's comprehensive. It's continuously updated through the review of census and survey questionnaires. So that's the process that I was talking about. And then, it says, the content is largely derived from previous editions, but about 1,000 new titles were added. So that's exactly what Lynn's idea was, is to say, so you can compare these subsequent editions, and then from that extract the new titles that are being added. All right, so we found these volumes, these older volumes. So Lynn did this approach for 1990 to 2000. We found these older volumes going all the way back to 1900. So here's a 1991, here's a, 1921, on Haiti Trust, which is an online repository of non-copywritten material, including a lot of government documents. And we had them all keyed, so we finally have the data now. We're happy about that. And this is what it looks like, just in the PDF. So these are, this is from the 1990. This is just one page, well, part of it. And this is showing, the job titles here, these columns. So, for example, blurb writer, board chairman, bodybuilder. And then there's industry restrictions that, these job titles are affiliated with. So that's the type of industries you would see those jobs in. And then from those two pieces of information, coders are told, look, then you should classify that job in that particular census occupation, right? So, for example, bodybuilders are not maybe an industry you would think. They're in motor vehicles and motor vehicle equipment. So, they're assemblers, okay? So that's a different type of, but that's basically how it works, right? So, but you can see how detailed this is compared to the census occupation titles that they feed into. So there's about 300 census occupations and about 30,000 titles. Okay. Now, as I already mentioned, then we follow Lynn in comparing those two titles from decade to decade, extracting the new ones, which involves, some matching and a bunch of manual revision as well. And then, the downside of this is that you don't actually observe employment in these individual detailed titles, but you do observe employment in the census occupation. So then you can construct a new title share per census occupation that tells you how much new work is being created in this particular census occupation. So that's the approach we follow first. Later we'll try to improve on that by looking at individual workers. Okay. So just to give you a little bit of examples of the type of titles that we've encountered. So this is from 1950 to 2016, which is the data we've currently processed. So on the left column, you see a bunch of those, or let's say, typical technology, high skill using jobs. So there are many of those. So textile chemists in the 1960s, engineers of computer applications in the 1970s, artificial intelligence specialists in the 2000s, right? So there is a lot of job titles that are emerging that you see, all right, these are really using the frontier technology of that decade, right? But then there's another column of very different types of titles that we also see many examples of, like tattooers emerging in 1950, pageants directors in 1960, bowling alley refinishers in 1970, when else, and oyster preparers in 2000. So these are not clearly all that skill using or even directly using new technologies, right? So that's sort of the more broader view that I was talking about before, that we want to give the sort of the evolution of new work and how we want to study that. All right. Now here come some very preliminary results on how the locus of new work has changed over this period. Still much work to be done, as you'll see, but just to give a bit of a flavor of like what are we finding so far in the data. So firstly, we're going to be looking at how is new work different in terms of its occupational composition compared to existing work for each of these decades, and how is that changing over time. So this type of graph I'm going to be showing a bunch of versions of. So this is occupational groups from the Census occupational code from 1990 that we're consistently applying across all these decades, ranked by wage, right? So these are the lowest paid occupations like farming and mining, health and personal services. In the middle we have construction, transportation, production and admin, sales, and then the higher professional managers. And then this is showing existing work in 1950 in blue, and those shares sum to 1. So it's showing the distribution across those broad occupational groups of existing work. And then in red it's showing also summing to 1, the distribution of new work that has emerged between 1940 and 1950. Right, across these groups. So you can compare the two bars and see, which categories is new work adding more to relative to what was already there in that decade. So what this is showing is, for 1950, is a kind of reverse polarization picture, right? So there's actually less new work being created in the most low-skilled groups like farming and personal services, and also professionals and managers, and more in these middle groups here. So more in production, transportation, and clerical and admin, and some technicians as well. Right? So this is kind of a reverse picture of polarization that we see here in the 1950s. Now if we roll forward one decade, so here we're looking at new work that has arisen between 1950 and 1960, and comparing that to existing work in 1960, we're seeing kind of the same. We're seeing more the rise of sort of clerical and admin jobs, right? So we're seeing these sort of white collar, middle skilled new titles being added in 1960. 1970 even stronger, right? So really the rise of these, sales, clerical and admin, but a decline now in production work. So way fewer new titles in these type of production occupations in 1970 compared to the earlier decade that I looked at. First, 1950, 1960, but still not much action at the very top, right? Or the very bottom. And this, still continuing more, right? It's a similar pattern as before in the 1980s. So what happened between 1970 and 1980 is still more of this middle, white-collar administrative work, but not much here and here. So far we're still seeing this sort of reverse polarization, although a shift, from more production towards more administrative. But then that changes when we look at new work added between 1980 and 1990. So this is, again, blue, existing work in 1990. Red is a new work added between 1980 and 1990, showing this polarization emerging. Right? So here we now see that in these middling categories, there is fewer new titles being created than there was as an employment share of existing work. But there's now this big increase in new titles in professionals, as well as some in personal services. Right? So this is the sort of change in the locus of new work I was talking about before. This then continues, so this is looking at work added between 1990 and 2000, so even more stark sort of rise here at the top, and then you see really a decline here of the, let's say, automation of office work that has been documented in the literature, right? So a decline in new titles in these sort of middling white-collar jobs. And then even more starkly so in the most recent 15 years we look at. So here we really see, an increase in health services, personal services, really very small share of new titles are being added here in the middle, and then a big increase here at the top. Okay, so basically the way we think of these patterns is, we don't claim or think that new work creation is the only way that that work is changing. So there's very likely also be a lot of changes in work, for existing titles. But we think of these new titles emerging as kind of the extensive margin or the leading edge of new work creation, in the sense that occupations where a lot of new titles are being added, a lot of new work is being added, are probably also the ones where a lot of existing work is being transformed by the same type of forces of a particular automation. Right. Okay, so let me speed ahead a little bit. Skip this summary. Let me just now show a few descriptives of basically the workers that are employed in these new occupations. And firstly, let me show by wage. So this is showing the mean log wage for new work and existing work. So red is new, blue is existing, over these different decades, showing that there were quite a few decades in the past where actually new work was was average paid or a little bit below average paid, but then that changed to it being higher paid. So the reason you would care about that is, you might say, okay, that's great. So new work is being added for these more higher paying categories. But another way to think about that is a sort of there's fewer new titles being created for lower skilled workers in those categories. So it's much more of a skill bias new job creation that we're seeing there. In 1950, by the way, there's a little bit higher wage for new work because there's a decline of new titles in the lowest group, which is farming and mining. Okay, and then just to talk a little bit about education and gender, which are some of the most stark patterns we've found so far. So this is showing new and existing work among non-college workers, again defined as those with high school or less. So showing that both new and existing work is becoming less intense in non-college workers, right? But there's a real decoupling of this trend between new and existing work, starting in 1990 with, for new work, this just falls off a cliff. Whereas before, they were kind of declining in tandem. So one way to think about this, if you think of new work emerging where demand is increasing, is that there's a demand shift against these non-college workers occurring since the 1990s. That wasn't present before because new and existing work were just declining at the same pace. So that change in the locus of work, we think, ties into that, differences in reallocation for polarization that I showed you before between the different skill groups. Okay, and then finally for women, so we see that new work is predominantly female, so a lot of new work, actually, women are overrepresented relative to existing work. But from other analysis we've done that I don't have on a slide here, we also have seen that the types of new work that women do tends to be a little bit less concentrated in those high-tech, frontier, most high-paying jobs and more concentrated in the lower paid, personal services. So that's a sort of caveat to this overall pattern. Okay. A very brief note about the microlevel. So what we've done so far is limited in the sense that it's all hinging on, identifying new work at the occupational level, right? So the demographics that we've seen are all saying, the workers that are employed in these new occupations, how are they different, right? Ideally, of course, we'd want to identify individual workers in these new titles. And that's what we're aiming to do here by actually using a complete census records that are, 1940 going back are now publicly available, where we can actually see people's write-ins, and we can match them to the titles, the detailed 30,000 titles that we have, and then actually use that to describe the evolution of new work. So we'll be able to do that from 1940 back, and we're also working on getting this data access for some more recent decades as well. As I said, so that will help much better understand the individual characteristics of this work. For example, so if you want to study the geography of new work, it's much better to do that based on the actual location of people employed in those titles rather than to use the occupational distribution across space. And it makes all sorts of assumptions about what that is, how homogeneous that is. It also would allow us to test some of the underlying assumptions for this occupation approach, right? To see, is employment really proportional to the title share? Are these average workers in these occupations really representative of the workers that are in new work within these occupations, et cetera? So that's what we're aiming to do there. So far, we only have like a proof of concept, which is that we've replicated sort of the main changes in occupational distribution of new work compared to existing work for 1940 using complete count. And this is based on individual workers, not on occupations. And so we were able to match these titles, and we see sort of similar patterns. So that gives us some confidence that we can roll this approach out and see what we can learn from that. But that's as far as we've gotten so far. So this is confirming what we've seen before, which is a lot of this new work was more in operatives, craftsmen, foremen, some semi-professional as well in this decade than in more recent decades. Okay, just to conclude, if I have time. So I think what we so far have concluded is, we do see a substantial change in the locus of new work, whether we measure that by occupation, by wage, education, or gender. And we think that these nature of these changes broadly correspond to the overall change in skill demands we've seen over this period. So we see this sort of, let's say, anti-polarization period before, in the post-war, and then we see this polarization pattern from from 19 forward. So it seems that this new work is an important dimension to try and understand those changes that have been discussed. Next steps is do a bunch more data work. So that's it. And we're very grateful to a bunch of people who are helping us do that. So thank you very much.